The day I found out they sold the house without telling me, I felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. That old Texas home wasn't just a building. It was the heart of my life, the place where I raised my children, where every corner held a memory etched deep into my soul. I'd spent decades there, every creak in the floor, the worn wooden steps, the faded wallpaper. They all whispered stories of laughter and tears, of birthdays and quiet nights. And then suddenly it was gone. Just like that. I remember the phone call like it was yesterday. My daughter's voice was hesitant, almost guilty. "Mom, we had to do something with the house. It was too much to keep up." But they never asked me. Not once. I sat in my kitchen, the morning light filtering through the lace curtains, clutching the receiver as if it might snap. Sold it. Without me. The realization hit harder than I could have imagined. It wasn't the money, they hadn't even told me what they got for it. It was the betrayal. The cold fact that my own family looked at my home and saw nothing but an asset to be liquidated, a problem to be solved behind my back. I wandered through the rooms in my mind, recalling the day I first walked through that front door as a young wife, full of hope and dreams. The way my children's laughter had filled the hallways, the countless holidays gathered around the fireplace, the quiet afternoons spent rocking on the porch watching the sun dip behind the Texas pines. That house was my sanctuary. It wasn't just timber and nails, it was the fabric of my family's story, woven through with love and sacrifice. But now the walls I had leaned on, the foundation of my life, had been stripped away. I felt a cold knot in my chest, a mix of grief and disbelief swirling inside me. How could they do this? How could those I trusted most, those I had given everything to, decide the fate of my home without a word? The very thought made me ache, not just for the loss of the house, but for the fracture it revealed in what I thought was unbreakable. I sat down heavily in my favorite armchair, the one by the window where I had spent countless afternoons crocheting and watching the world go by. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of a bird. I traced the outline of the faded floral upholstery, trying to ground myself in something familiar. The house had been my anchor through storms of life, divorce, illness, the loss of loved ones. It was where I found strength when everything else seemed to fall apart. And now that anchor had been yanked away. Tears came unbidden, but I didn't wipe them away. I let them fall, each one a testament to the years I had poured into that home. The walls that had once echoed with joy now seemed to mock me with their emptiness. I thought about the day my children grew up and left, the one-by-one empty rooms that became silent witnesses to time passing. Yet, through it all, I held on to that house, believing it was my legacy, a place that belonged to me as much as to anyone. But it was clear now that to my family it was just property, something to be sold off when it became inconvenient. I felt a bitter sting. Was this what I had become to them? A burden to be discarded when the price was right? It was a painful thought, one that gnawed at my heart and left me feeling more alone than ever. I replayed the conversations, the subtle hints over the years about the upkeep being too much, the taxes too high, the repairs piling up. I had brushed them aside, thinking we would find a way, that family meant more than money. But evidently I was wrong. They saw the house as a problem to solve, and I was just an obstacle in their path. The betrayal was not just in the act itself but in the silence, the secrecy. No calls to discuss, no meetings to decide, just a quiet transaction that erased decades of memories. I felt invisible, erased from the story I had lived and loved. It was as if my family had written me out without a word, leaving me with nothing but the echo of what once was. That night I sat by the window, the Texas stars stretching endlessly above. The sky was vast and unchanging, but my world felt shattered. I thought about the years I had sacrificed, the dreams I had built, the love I had given. And I wondered what it meant to be family when the ties could be severed so easily. As I stared into the darkness, I realized this was more than just the loss of a house. It was the unraveling of trust, the breaking of bonds I had believed unbreakable. The pain was deep, a wound that cut through the very core of who I was. Yet, beneath the sorrow, a quiet ember of resolve began to glow. I might have been blindsided, but I was not defeated. The house was gone, yes, but my story was far from over. I had to find a way to hold on to my dignity, my memories, and my sense of self. I had to understand how this happened, why my family had chosen money over me, and what I could do to reclaim what was taken. Not just the house but the respect and love I deserved. That night I made a silent vow. I would not let this betrayal define me. I would dig deep, find my strength, and confront the harsh truth. The road ahead would be painful, but I would walk it with my head held high. Because some things like love, family, and home were worth fighting for, even when it felt like the whole world had turned its back. In the days that followed, I found myself drifting through a fog of disbelief and hurt. Every familiar place in town seemed to remind me of what I had lost. The grocery store where I had shopped for decades, the church where I had sung hymns with my family, even the old oak tree in the park where my children had played, all felt tainted by the shadow of the betrayal. I felt like a ghost in my own life, disconnected and adrift. But amid the ache, a small flicker of clarity emerged. I began to ask questions quietly, cautiously. Who was involved in the sale? What legal steps had been taken? Was there anything I could do to challenge it? The anger simmered beneath the surface, fueling a growing determination to understand the truth. I reached out to a neighbor, a kind woman who had known me for years, whose eyes reflected the same sadness I felt. She listened patiently as I recounted the story, her silence a balm to my wounded heart. "They should have told you," she said softly. "No one should be left in the dark like this." Her words gave me comfort, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. There were people who cared, who saw the injustice of what had been done. With her encouragement, I began to explore the legal side of things, filling out forms, making phone calls, trying to piece together the puzzle of how my family could turn against me so easily. Each discovery was like a fresh wound. The paperwork signed in my absence, the meetings held without my knowledge, the cold language of contracts and deeds that seemed designed to erase me from the story. But with every step my resolve grew stronger. I was not going to fade quietly into the background. I was going to fight to reclaim my place, to honor the memories that home held, and to demand the respect I deserved. The journey was just beginning, and though the road ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. I would not be silenced. Not by betrayal, not by loss, not by the broken promises of those I loved most. This house had been my life's work, and even if the doors were closed to me, the spirit of what it represented would live on, in my heart and in the fight I was ready to wage. The days that followed the discovery of the sale felt like I was walking through a fog, lost, bewildered, and adrift in a world that no longer made sense. I woke up each morning with a heavy ache, a mixture of grief and confusion pressing down on my chest. How had it come to this? How had my family, the people I thought I could trust implicitly, turned their backs on me without a word? The house was gone, and with it, a piece of my soul had been ripped away. I found myself replaying memories, searching for signs I might have missed. There were moments, little conversations, passing remarks about expenses or upkeep, that now took on a darker meaning. But back then I had brushed them aside, assuming we would face challenges together as a family. Now those moments felt like cracks in the foundation, warnings ignored until the whole structure collapsed. The silence from my family was perhaps the hardest to bear. No explanations, no apologies, just a cold distance that stretched between us like an unbridgeable chasm. I reached out to my children hoping for some clarity, some sign that they understood the pain they had caused. But their responses were clipped, defensive, and filled with justifications about financial burdens and practicality. It was as if they saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be loved. Alone in my small apartment, I wrestled with a storm of emotions. Loneliness settled deep into my bones, a constant companion that whispered doubts and fears. Had I failed them? Was I too stubborn to let go? But beneath the sadness, a fierce determination began to stir. I refused to be erased so easily. This was my life, my story, and I wasn't ready to surrender it without a fight. I started to look back over the years, piecing together the family dynamics that had led us here. Financial disputes had always been a source of tension, but I had hoped love and loyalty would hold us together. Instead, money had become a wedge driving us apart. I saw now how misunderstandings had festered, how resentment had quietly grown beneath the surface. It was painful to admit, but the cracks had been there for a long time. One afternoon I sat down with an old photo album, tracing my fingers over the faded images of birthdays, graduations, and family gatherings. Each smile captured a moment of happiness, but beneath the surface, I sensed the unspoken struggles that had slowly pulled us apart. It was a complicated tapestry, love tangled with frustration, hope shadowed by disappointment. Determined not to be overwhelmed by grief, I decided to take action. But where did I even begin? The legal world was foreign to me, filled with jargon and rules that seemed designed to confuse and intimidate. I reached out to a local community center, hoping to find a bit of guidance. There I met a kind woman named Linda, a volunteer advocate who listened patiently as I poured out my story. Linda didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, she helped me understand my rights, explaining the steps I could take to challenge the sale and seek justice. It wasn't a guarantee of success, but it was a lifeline, a way to reclaim some control over a situation that had spiraled beyond my grasp. With her support, I began to gather documents, make phone calls, and slowly piece together the legal puzzle. Meanwhile, my neighbor, Mrs. Carter, became a quiet source of strength. She stopped by often with homemade cookies and a warm smile, reminding me that I wasn't completely alone. She shared stories of her own struggles and losses, offering empathy without judgment. Her presence was a balm to my wounded heart, a reminder that community still existed amid betrayal. As I delved deeper into the situation, I uncovered troubling details. Some family members had pushed hard for the sale, painting it as the only viable option without fully informing me. There were whispers of misrepresentation and coercion, decisions made behind closed doors where my voice was absent. The more I learned, the clearer it became that this was not just a matter of practicality. It was a betrayal of trust on a fundamental level. The realization fueled my resolve. I began to document everything: the phone calls, the emails, the conversations. Every piece of evidence was a thread in the tapestry of my fight for justice. It was exhausting and emotionally draining, but I knew I had to keep going. This was about more than a house. It was about standing up for myself, for the dignity and respect I deserved as a mother and a person. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. Nights when tears came freely, when the loneliness was suffocating. But in those dark hours, I reminded myself of the woman I had been all my life, the one who had faced hardship with quiet strength, who had weathered storms without losing hope. That woman was still inside me, ready to rise. I started to reach out to others who had faced similar betrayals, joining support groups and online forums where stories like mine were shared. Their courage inspired me, their victories gave me hope. I wasn't alone in this fight, and together we were stronger. The process was slow, filled with setbacks and frustrating delays. But each small victory, a returned phone call, a document uncovered, a kind word from a stranger, was a step forward. I learned to navigate the complexities of the legal system, to advocate for myself in ways I never thought possible. It was empowering, transforming my pain into purpose. Despite the challenges, I held on to the belief that understanding and reconciliation were possible. I reached out to my family again, not with anger, but with a desire for honest conversation. Some doors remained closed, but others opened a crack, allowing for tentative dialogue. It was fragile, but it was a start. Through it all, I clung to the memories of that house, not as a lost possession, but as a symbol of what mattered most. It wasn't the walls or the roof that made it home. It was the love and history we shared. That essence could never be sold or taken away. In quiet moments, I found solace in small routines: watering the plants on my windowsill, writing letters I never sent, walking through the neighborhood where the old house once stood. Each act was a thread weaving me back into the fabric of my own life. I realized that while the betrayal had shaken me, it had not broken me. I was more than the sum of my losses. I was a woman who had loved deeply, who had been hurt deeply, and who was learning to rise again. The path ahead was uncertain, but I was ready to face it, one step at a time. The house might have been sold, but my story was far from over. I was determined to reclaim my voice, my dignity, and my future. Because sometimes the greatest strength comes not from holding on to what's lost, but from finding the courage to move forward, even when everything feels broken. Armed with the knowledge I'd painstakingly gathered and the quiet strength that had been building inside me, I knew it was time to stop waiting and start fighting. The betrayal of my family and the secret sale of my home had left me feeling small and powerless for far too long. But no longer. I was ready to step into the light, to expose the truth and reclaim what was rightfully mine. The first step was confronting the legal realities of the situation. With Linda's guidance, I filed documents to challenge the sale, pointing to evidence of misrepresentation and coercion that had been used to push the transaction through. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the technical jargon felt like a wall I'd never climb, and the cold, impersonal nature of the legal system threatened to crush my spirit. But each page I filled, every form I submitted, was a stand against the silence that had surrounded me. I discovered that some family members had pushed hard for the sale, using their influence to sideline me completely. They had painted a picture of necessity, of financial burden, but behind the scenes, I uncovered emails and letters that suggested otherwise. There were discussions about quick profits, pressures to move on quickly, and attempts to keep me in the dark. The more I uncovered, the more it became clear that this was not simply about practicality, it was about control. One afternoon, I sat across from my lawyer in a small office filled with books and papers, the weight of it all pressing down on me. "You have a strong case," she said quietly, "but it will be an uphill battle. They'll fight back hard." I nodded, feeling the mix of fear and determination swirling inside me. I wasn't naive. I knew this fight would be painful, and the family I once trusted might turn even colder. But I was ready. The turning point came when I gathered enough evidence to confront them directly. I arranged a meeting, not out of hope for reconciliation, but to lay everything bare. I needed them to see that their actions had consequences, that the truth could no longer be hidden behind closed doors. The day of the meeting, I walked into the room with my head held high, clutching the folders of documents that told the story they tried to erase. The atmosphere was tense, thick with unspoken accusations and old resentments. Faces I once loved looked away, some with surprise, others with anger. I took a deep breath and began to speak, calmly but firmly outlining what I had discovered: the misrepresentation, the coercion, the secret dealings that had stripped me of my home. I presented the emails, the letters, the legal notices. I spoke not just of the house, but of the betrayal, the broken trust. For a moment the room was silent. Then voices rose, defensive, angry, some trying to justify their actions, others pleading for understanding. But I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated or dismissed. I reminded them that family meant more than money, that respect and honesty were the foundations we had lost. The confrontation fractured the family further. Some members, faced with the undeniable evidence, began to question the decisions they had supported. Others dug in their heels, unwilling to admit fault. But the power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the passive victim. I was a force to be reckoned with. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of that meeting spread. Some relatives reached out to me privately, expressing regret and a desire to make amends. Others avoided me altogether, unwilling to face the truth. But through it all, I felt a growing sense of empowerment. I had taken back my voice, and with it, a measure of control over a situation that had once seemed hopeless. My advocate Linda stood by my side throughout, helping me navigate the legal complexities and offering unwavering support. Together, we negotiated with the parties involved, pushing for a settlement that would recognize the wrongs done and provide some measure of restitution. It wasn't about money alone, it was about dignity, about being seen and heard. During this time, I also began to speak out publicly, sharing my story with local community groups, and even a small newspaper that wanted to highlight the issue of elder rights and family betrayal. The response was overwhelming. Many reached out with their own stories of loss and injustice, and a network of support began to form around me. I realized I was not alone in this fight, that my struggle was part of a larger battle for respect and fairness. One evening, after a long day of meetings and calls, I sat quietly with a cup of tea, reflecting on how far I had come. The journey had been brutal and exhausting, but I no longer felt broken. I had reclaimed my power in a way I never imagined possible. The house might have been sold, but I had unearthed something far more valuable: the strength to stand up for myself and demand justice. I knew the road ahead was still uncertain. The legal battle was far from over, and the wounds within my family were deep. But I had changed the course of this story. I was no longer a silent victim swept aside by greed and betrayal. I was a woman who had faced the storm and refused to be swept away. In the days that followed, as negotiations continued, I found moments of unexpected peace. I connected with others who had faced similar betrayals, drawing strength from their resilience. Together, we shared strategies and comfort, building a community where once there had only been isolation. I also began to dream again. Not just about what had been lost, but about what could still be built. The house was gone, but my life was not. There was still a future to claim, one shaped by my choices and my courage. The battle was far from over, but I was ready. With truth as my armor and resolve as my shield, I stepped forward into the fight that would define not just my home, but my very sense of self. Because sometimes the hardest battles lead to the greatest victories, and I was determined to win. The days that followed my confrontation with the family were some of the most turbulent I had ever endured. The truth I had laid bare unsettled the fragile balance that had existed, forcing cracks to widen in relationships I once thought unbreakable. I watched as the family I had known began to fracture, with some members retreating into silence, while others, perhaps burdened by guilt or conscience, reached out in tentative attempts to mend what had been broken. It was a strange and painful dance. Old wounds peeled open, raw emotions spilled freely, and the weight of years of unresolved tensions settled heavily in the air. But amid the chaos I sensed a shift. The power dynamics had changed. No longer was I the passive victim swept aside by their decisions. I was a force they could no longer ignore. With Linda's steady guidance and the support of newfound friends from the community, I entered negotiations with a spirit tempered by both determination and a desire for healing. We weren't just fighting for financial restitution, we were fighting for recognition, for the respect that had been denied me, for the dignity that was my birthright. The process was painstaking. Meetings stretched long into the evenings, emails and phone calls piling up as we navigated the tangled web of emotions and legalities. Some family members remained distant, unwilling to face the consequences of their actions. Others, however, surprised me with their willingness to listen, to acknowledge mistakes, and to find a way forward. One afternoon, as I sat across from my daughter in a quiet cafe, the tension between us was palpable but softened by a fragile hope. She spoke haltingly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Mom, I'm sorry," she said, voice trembling. "We didn't realize how much this would hurt you. We thought we were doing what was best, but we were wrong." Those words, simple and sincere, cracked open a door I thought had been sealed forever. I replied, my own voice thick with emotion, "I just want to be part of this family again. Not just as someone to be dealt with, but as someone who matters." For the first time in months, I felt a tentative bridge forming between us, fragile but real. Outside of family circles, the community's response to my story continued to grow. Local advocates and neighbors rallied around me, sharing their own experiences and offering support. The small newspaper article had blossomed into a larger conversation about elder rights and family responsibility. I spoke at meetings, sharing not just my pain but the lessons I had learned about resilience and the importance of standing up for oneself. The support was a balm to my wounded heart, reminding me that my struggle was part of something larger. I was no longer isolated in my pain. Together we were forging a path toward justice and understanding. Throughout the negotiations, Linda and I worked tirelessly to ensure that any settlement not only compensated for the loss, but also included provisions to protect my future. It was about more than money. It was about restoring my dignity and securing a foundation on which I could rebuild my life. Slowly but surely, a resolution began to take shape. In quiet moments, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the fight for justice. I acknowledged the scars left behind, but also recognized the strength I had found within myself. This struggle had transformed me, revealing a resilience I hadn't fully known I possessed. As the family began to engage in honest conversations for the first time in years, I saw glimpses of healing. It was imperfect and uneven, but it was a start. The old wounds would take time to mend, but the willingness to confront the past was a crucial step forward. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and phone calls, I sat quietly by the window, watching the Texas sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The house that had once been my sanctuary was gone, but in its place I was building something new. A sense of peace, a community of support, and a renewed connection with those I loved. I realized that home was not just a physical place but a feeling, a sense of belonging and resilience that could not be sold or taken away. The fight had been hard, but it had also been necessary. Through it all, I had reclaimed not only my dignity but also my hope. The settlement negotiations continued to progress, and though the road ahead remained uncertain, I felt empowered. I was no longer at the mercy of others' decisions. I had taken control of my story, demanding respect and fairness. In the quiet strength of those moments, I understood that this chapter of my life was about more than loss. It was about renewal. It was about finding light in the darkness and building a future rooted in courage and self-worth. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, I held on to the promise of a new beginning. The journey was far from over, but I faced it with a heart ready to heal and a spirit unbroken. The day I stepped into my new home, I felt a surge of emotions I hadn't anticipated: relief, hope, and a quiet triumph that whispered beneath the surface of my heart. After the storm of betrayal and the long, exhausting fight that followed, this wasn't just a house. It was a fresh start, a symbol of resilience and the unyielding spirit that had carried me through the darkest chapters of my life. I remember unlocking the front door and stepping inside, the scent of fresh paint mingling with the soft light streaming through the windows. The floors beneath my feet were solid and warm, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness I had felt for so long. This place was mine, not because of history or memories etched into its walls, but because of the choice I'd made to reclaim my life on my own terms. The rooms were different from the old Texas home I'd lost, smaller in some ways, but filled with potential. I could already picture the sun spilling through the kitchen window in the morning, the quiet evenings in the living room where I'd curl up with a book, the laughter of friends and neighbors filling the air during warm summer nights. This home was a canvas, ready to be painted with new memories, new joys. In the weeks that followed, I poured my energy into making this house a home. I planted flowers along the walkway, hung photographs of family and friends on the walls, and filled each room with touches that reflected who I was now: a woman who had faced immense pain but refused to be defined by it. Every small task was a step toward healing, a declaration that I was still here, still standing. But this journey was about more than just rebuilding my own life. It was about using my story to shine a light on the silent struggles many elders face, the betrayals hidden behind closed doors, the loss of autonomy and dignity that so often goes unnoticed. I began speaking at community centers and support groups, sharing my experience not as a victim, but as a survivor and advocate. People listened. They reached out with their own stories of heartbreak and resilience. Together we formed a network of strength and solidarity, a community determined to fight for the rights and respect every elder deserves. I found purpose in this work, a way to transform my pain into hope for others. One afternoon, a young woman approached me after a talk. Her eyes were bright but weary. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said softly. "It gives me hope that I can stand up for myself too." Her words touched me deeply. This was the true victory, that my story could inspire courage in others, that from my darkest moments, light could emerge. At home, surrounded by the life I was building, I found peace I hadn't known in years. The ghosts of the past still lingered, but they no longer held power over me. I had learned that true home isn't about the walls or the land. It's about the strength within, the love we carry, and the hope we nurture. I thought often about my family, the fractures that remained, the conversations that had begun but were far from finished. I hoped that, in time, healing could continue, that forgiveness might find its way through the wounds. But whatever the future held, I knew I had reclaimed my dignity and my voice. Sitting on my porch one evening, watching the Texas sky blaze with sunset colors, I felt a profound gratitude. For the journey, for the lessons, for the unexpected strength that had risen from betrayal. I was living proof that even when everything seems lost, a new beginning is possible. The house was no longer just a place on a map. It was a testament to resilience, courage, and the enduring power of hope. And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, I whispered a quiet promise to myself. No matter what comes next, I will always find my way home.